Imagine a world where your entire identity, your worth, your very reason for existence, was tied to a single biological function. What if failing at that one task didn't just bring personal sorrow, but public shame, divine condemnation, and a complete unraveling of your place in society? Could a woman truly be considered dead in the eyes of her community while still breathing? We are going to step into that chilling reality, exploring the devastating consequences of being deemed barren in the year 1242. Number 1. The unwritten verdict: divorce, disinheritance, and the void of options. In the year 1242, life was harsh, often brutally short, and structured around strict societal rules. For a woman, her path was overwhelmingly clear: marry, bear children, and manage a household. There were very few alternative routes available, especially for those who did not come from noble or wealthy families, and even then, options were limited. So when a woman was unable to conceive and carry children to term, when her womb remained empty year after year, it wasn't just a quiet, personal tragedy. It was a public failure, a direct challenge to the very foundation of her marriage and her standing within her community. This inability to bear children often led to a profound and crushing unwritten verdict against her, one that carried the weight of social excommunication and practical ruin. Clear divorce, as we understand it today, was not common or easy to obtain in the High Middle Ages. The Church, which held immense power and influence over daily life, considered marriage a sacred sacrament, a bond divinely ordained and ideally unbreakable. However, while outright divorce was rare, annulments were possible, and sometimes the legal maneuvering around an infertile marriage could effectively achieve the same result as a modern divorce, leaving the woman utterly cast aside. An annulment was a declaration that the marriage had never been valid in the first place, often based on technicalities like pre-existing vows, undisclosed kinship between the spouses, or lack of proper consent. But what if the reason for the dissolution was the wife's failure to produce an heir? While not a direct grounds for annulment in the same way as, say, being too closely related, persistent barrenness could certainly lead a husband to seek a separation or to put his wife aside, especially if he was from a noble family desperate for an heir. He might argue that the marriage was not truly consummated in its purpose if it yielded no fruit, or he might simply find other, more convenient grounds to dissolve the union, knowing that her barrenness made her expendable. Consider the reality for a noblewoman. Her marriage was often less about love and more about alliances, land, and the continuation of a powerful lineage. If she failed to produce an heir, particularly a male one, the very purpose of her union from her husband's family's perspective was unfulfilled. Her husband's family, eager to secure their future and prevent their lands and titles from passing into other hands, would exert immense pressure. They might push for an annulment, or perhaps a more pragmatic, if equally cruel, solution. The husband might simply take another wife, effectively abandoning the first one, perhaps sending her to a convent if she was lucky, or simply back to her own family in disgrace. Records from the period, though fragmented, show instances where powerful men successfully navigated the church courts to dissolve unions that were unfruitful, essentially discarding wives who could not fulfill their primary duty. For women of the common sort, the consequences were equally, if not more, devastating. A farmer's wife who bore no children offered no future labor for the fields, no hands to help with the harvest, no sons to inherit the leasehold or the meager family possessions. Her husband, perhaps pressured by his own family or simply desperate for continuity, might not be able to divorce her in a legal sense, but he could certainly make her life unbearable, effectively ostracizing her within her own home. He might neglect her, treat her with contempt, or in some cases, even take another woman into his household as a de facto wife, hoping she would bear him children, while his legal wife suffered in humiliation and neglect. In a society without formal safety nets, a woman without children was often entirely dependent on her husband's goodwill, and if that goodwill evaporated, her position became incredibly precarious. Disinheritance was another grim specter haunting barren women. While a woman usually had dower rights, meaning she was entitled to a portion of her husband's property upon his death, these rights were often contingent on the continuation of the family line, particularly if there were no children to inherit directly. If she bore no children, her husband's family might fight tooth and nail to prevent her from inheriting anything substantial, arguing that she had failed in her fundamental duty to the family. They might use any legal means available to reduce her dower, or even try to invalidate it altogether, leaving her destitute. Without a son or daughter to advocate for her, or to inherit her husband's name and property, her own claim to wealth or status after his death was significantly weakened, making her vulnerable to the machinations of her husband's relatives. And what about the void of options? In 1242, a single woman had very few respected roles. For most, marriage was the only path to economic security, social standing, and a legitimate place within the community. If a woman failed to bear children and was subsequently abandoned or cast out by her husband, what then? She couldn't easily join a convent if she was not of a wealthy background or if she was considered damaged goods by society. Most convents required dowries themselves and primarily served as places for unmarried women of noble birth or for widows. A common woman cast out for barrenness faced a stark reality. She might be forced into destitution, relying on charity, or in the worst cases, resorting to begging or even prostitution to survive. Her reputation would be shattered, her social ties severed, and her future prospects bleak. Consider the narrative of a woman like Alara, a fictional woman from a small village in Wessex in 1242. Married at 16, she spent 5 years praying, hoping, enduring the increasing whispers. When no child came, her husband, Thomas, initially patient, grew cold. His family, particularly his stern mother, began to openly lament their unfruitful daughter-in-law. Thomas didn't divorce her, not legally, but he stopped sharing her bed. Openly courted a widow from a neighboring village, taking her in as a housekeeper. Alara, still legally his wife, was reduced to a servant in her own home, her status evaporated, her voice unheard. Her own family, ashamed and with little means to support her, could not take her back without great hardship. She was a ghost in her own life, a woman alive but socially erased, her existence a testament to the unwritten verdict delivered by an empty womb. Her story, repeated in countless variations across the land, speaks volumes about the utter void of options and the profound social death sentence that accompanied barrenness in the High Middle Ages. Number 2, the public shame, ostracization, disgrace, and the loss of esteem. In the tightly knit communities of 1242, where every person's life was deeply intertwined with their neighbors, there was little room for privacy, especially when it came to something as fundamental as a woman's ability to bear children. Failure to produce offspring was not a quiet, private sorrow confined within the walls of a single home. It was a public spectacle, a source of relentless scrutiny, and a catalyst for profound public shame. This shame manifested as ostracization, disgrace, and an agonizing loss of esteem that could erode a woman's very sense of self-worth. Imagine the village in 1242. News traveled by word of mouth, quickly and often cruelly. A new bride, fresh from her marriage, would be observed with keen interest. Her growing belly would be a source of celebration, a sign of a blessed union and a healthy woman. But if seasons passed, and then years, without the telltale signs of pregnancy, the whispers would begin. First, they might be sympathetic, expressions of pity mixed with concern, but soon, pity curdled into something far more insidious: suspicion, judgment, and outright contempt. Every shared glance, every hushed conversation behind cupped hands, became a constant reminder of her perceived failure. A woman who was unable to bear children was often seen as somehow defective, incomplete, or even cursed. This wasn't just a personal failing, it was a communal one, impacting the family's future, the village's demographics, and even its perceived standing in the eyes of God. In a society where large families were common and children were celebrated as blessings, an empty cradle stood as a stark, damning symbol. This public shame wasn't just about feeling bad, it was about losing your place. Your identity as a wife and a woman was inextricably linked to motherhood. Without it, you became an anomaly, an outcast. Consider the daily life of such a woman. She would attend church, where sermons often emphasized the divine blessing of children, making her feel even more acutely her supposed failing. Communal well or the village market, other women, surrounded by their bustling broods, might subtly shift away from her, their conversations hushed as she approached. Children, with their innocent cruelty, might stare or even point. The social dynamics would subtly but surely change. Invitations to celebrations might become less frequent, or her presence might be tolerated rather than welcomed. She would find herself on the periphery, an outsider looking in. The husband's standing was also deeply affected, which in turn amplified the wife's shame. A man whose wife bore no children was often seen as unfortunate, perhaps even ridiculed or pitied. This pressure on the husband would then often be redirected back to his wife, further isolating her. He might become withdrawn, resentful, or even openly critical of her. His inability to secure an heir, crucial for his family's legacy and his own social standing, was often laid squarely at her feet, regardless of who was biologically responsible for the infertility. In a society that lacked modern medical understanding, the burden of barrenness was almost always placed on the woman. Imagine a woman named Agnes in a small Norman village in 1242. She had been married for 8 years to Robert, a robust farmer. Despite their efforts, no children had blessed their union. Agnes had once been known for her cheerful spirit and her deft hands at spinning wool. Now, her shoulders were perpetually hunched, her gaze downcast. When the village women gathered to celebrate a new birth, Agnes would quietly slip away, the joyous cries of infants and the proud laughter of mothers a painful echo of her own empty arms. Communal oven, where women would bring their dough to bake, conversations would abruptly cease when she approached. She overheard whispers of barren Agnes, unlucky Robert. Her own mother-in-law, once kind, now openly favored a younger cousin of Robert's, subtly hinting at the possibility of a new union for her son. This constant, low-level hum of judgment, this subtle shifting of social interactions, amounted to a deeply painful form of ostracization. It was not always outright exclusion. Sometimes it was far more insidious, a gradual fading into the background, a feeling of invisibility despite being physically present. She was no longer seen as a full member of the community, but as a failed woman. Her voice might be less heard in village meetings, her opinions less valued. Her ability to contribute to the social cohesion of the community, which was largely built around family units, was undermined. Moreover, the psychological toll of this public shame cannot be overstated. A woman in this position might internalize the blame, believing herself to be genuinely flawed, cursed, or unworthy. Constant scrutiny and the pervasive whispers could lead to profound feelings of depression, anxiety, and hopelessness. In a world where self-worth was so externally validated, the loss of public esteem was akin to losing a part of her own identity. She might withdraw from social interactions, become isolated, further cementing her status as an outsider. Her spirit, once vibrant, could wither under the weight of constant societal judgment, leaving her a hollow shell of her former self, a living testament to the crushing power of public shame in medieval society. Number 3, the whispers and cures, misunderstanding fertility and the shadow of superstition. 1242, the intricacies of human reproduction were shrouded in a thick fog of ignorance, superstition, and rudimentary medical understanding. The scientific knowledge we possess today about ovaries, sperm, hormones, and conception was centuries away. When a couple struggled to conceive, or a woman suffered repeated miscarriages, the blame almost universally fell on the woman, and the explanations for her barrenness veered wildly from the mildly misguided to the outright bizarre, often tinged with the ominous shadow of witchcraft and divine displeasure. This profound misunderstanding not only failed to help, but often compounded the suffering of women deemed infertile, subjecting them to strange cures and sinister accusations. Prevailing belief was that a woman's body was a vessel, and if that vessel remained empty, it was her fault. There was little to no concept that a man could be infertile. The male role in reproduction was seen as primarily that of planting the seed. The female's role was to provide fertile ground for it to grow. If the seed did not sprout, the ground was considered barren. This fundamental misconception placed an unfair and immense burden solely on women. Scholars of the time, drawing on ancient Greek and Roman texts, often described the female body in ways that were medically inaccurate, perpetuating theories about wandering wombs or imbalances of humors that supposedly caused infertility. The lack of scientific understanding led to a proliferation of cures and rituals, many of which were utterly ineffective, some harmlessly absurd, and others potentially dangerous. People turned to a mix of folk remedies, magical practices, and religious rituals, all designed to coax fertility from a woman's body. Women might be advised to consume strange concoctions of herbs, animal parts, or even ground-up minerals. Some cures involved specific diets, often restrictive or unpleasant. For example, a woman might be told to eat particular parts of an animal known for its fertility, like a rabbit, in the belief that its virility would transfer to her. Or she might be advised to sleep with certain amulets or charms under her pillow, or to visit particular sacred wells or trees believed to possess healing or fertile powers. Consider a woman like Isolde in a village near Canterbury in 1242. After years of marriage without a child, her desperation would grow. Her husband's aunt, a woman known for her knowledge of old ways, might suggest Isolde wear a small bag of dried mandrake root tied around her waist, or bathe in water infused with specific herbs gathered under a full moon. Perhaps a local wise woman, who might be healer or suspected witch depending on her reputation, would prescribe a potion made from unfamiliar plants, or recommend a ritual involving burying a piece of her clothing in a freshly plowed field under the light of a new moon, symbolically aligning her body with the fertile earth. These practices, while offering a semblance of hope, ultimately failed to address the underlying biological realities and could sometimes expose a vulnerable woman to dangerous substances or procedures. Beyond the well-meaning but misguided remedies, there was a darker side to the misunderstanding of fertility, the shadow of superstition and accusations of witchcraft. In a deeply religious and often fearful society, anything unexplained could easily be attributed to malevolent forces. If a woman was barren, particularly if she had a reputation for being unconventional or had incurred the displeasure of a neighbor, whispers could turn to accusations of being cursed or even being a witch. It was believed that witches could prevent conception, cause miscarriages, or otherwise bind a woman's womb through dark magic. Such accusations, even if unfounded, could be devastating, potentially leading to social ostracization, physical harm, or, in later centuries, even trials and execution. While widespread witch hunts were more prevalent in later centuries, the fear and suspicion of witchcraft were certainly present in 1242, and an unexplained barrenness could certainly ignite such fears within a community. Furthermore, some of the cures themselves bordered on the superstitious. Pilgrimages to shrines dedicated to saints believed to aid fertility were common. Women would travel long distances, endure hardships, and offer prayers and votive offerings, hoping for divine intervention. While these offered spiritual solace, they did not address biological realities. Others might try to transfer fertility by associating with pregnant women or women with many children, believing that proximity or touch could somehow impart the blessing of fertility. The lack of accurate medical understanding created a climate of fear and helplessness for infertile women. They were caught between ineffective remedies, the pressure to conform to societal expectations, and the terrifying possibility of being branded as cursed or malicious. This blend of ignorance and superstition not only made barrenness a social death sentence, but also subjected women to often humiliating, ineffective, or even dangerous treatments, all while living under the constant threat of malicious accusation. It was a tragic cycle of blame, despair, and futile hope, perpetuated by a society that simply did not comprehend the complex miracle of life itself. Number 4, the lineage lock, patriarchy, property, and the power of sons. In the year 1242, the world was overwhelmingly patriarchal. This wasn't just a social preference, it was the very bedrock of society, economy, and power. Everything revolved around the male line, the lineage, the family name, the inheritance of land, titles, and property. For a woman, her primary value, her fundamental contribution to this system, was to provide heirs and, crucially, to provide sons. Failing to do so meant she was a broken cog in the grand machinery of lineage, effectively locking her out of the system that defined status, security, and continuity. Let's unpack the power of sons. For the nobility, the stakes were incredibly high. Titles, castles, vast estates, and political influence were all passed down through primogeniture, meaning the eldest son inherited everything. Without a male heir, a noble family faced an existential crisis. Their lands might revert to the crown, pass to a distant male relative, or worse, be divided among daughters, weakening the family's power base. A noblewoman's inability to bear sons was therefore a catastrophic failure for her husband and his entire family. Her marriage, intended to secure the future of the house, had failed its most vital purpose. She was not just a personal disappointment, she was a threat to the stability and power of a dynastic line. Historians' records from the period are replete with examples of powerful lords divorcing or abandoning wives who failed to produce male heirs, sometimes after many years of marriage and even after bearing daughters. The urgency for a son trumped almost everything else. Consider a powerful baron in Picardy in 1242, Lord Ant. He had married Lady Isabel for political alliance and, crucially, for heirs. After a decade, Isabel had given him 2 daughters, lovely and intelligent girls, but no son. Anton's younger brother, always covetous of the family lands, began to subtly undermine Isabel's position, suggesting she was unblessed or that the bloodline was weakening. King himself, eager to ensure stability in his powerful vassals, might even pressure Anton to secure a male heir. Isabel, despite her beauty and her noble upbringing, became a source of anxiety and pressure. She felt the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down on her, the unspoken question in every glance: where is the son? Her status, initially high as a baron's wife, plummeted with each passing year she failed to bear a male child. She was not just a wife, she was a vessel, and if that vessel failed its purpose, it could be discarded. The same patriarchal emphasis, though perhaps less dramatic in scale, permeated the lives of common folk. For a farmer, a craftsman, or a merchant, a son was essential for continuing the family trade, working the land, or inheriting the tools of the craft. Daughters were valuable for their dowries and for forging new alliances through marriage, but they would typically leave their birth family to join their husbands. A son, however, stayed. He learned the trade, worked alongside his father, and eventually inherited the farm, the workshop, or the business. Without a son, the family name might die out, and their hard-earned property could be fragmented or passed to unrelated individuals upon the father's death, essentially erasing the family's legacy. Imagine Robert, a prosperous miller in rural England in 1242. He had built his mill up over years, a testament to his family's industry. His wife, Marjorie, had given him 3 daughters. While he loved his girls, the anxiety about the future of his mill gnawed at him. Who would inherit it? Who would work it when he was old? His neighbors, seeing his growing family of girls, would offer commiserating glances or even advise him to pray harder for a strong son. Marjorie bore the brunt of this anxiety. She felt the pressure to produce a son not just for Robert, but for the very survival of his craft, his livelihood, and the continuity of his family's place in the village. Her worth as a woman was inextricably linked to her ability to produce a male heir who would secure the family's future. This emphasis on sons was not merely a cultural preference. It was deeply ingrained in the legal and economic structures of the time. Property laws, inheritance customs, and societal norms were all designed to preserve and pass on wealth and status through the male line. A woman who bore only daughters or no children at all disrupted this fundamental order. She became an anomaly, a challenge to the system. Inability to provide a son was seen as a grave dereliction of her duty, not just to her husband, but to his entire lineage, past and future. This lineage lock meant that a barren woman, or even a woman who bore only daughters, often faced a chilling reality. Her purpose, as defined by her patriarchal society, had not been fulfilled. She had failed to secure the future of her husband's family, and in doing so, had forfeited much of her own value and security within that family. Her life, for all its personal struggles and hopes, was ultimately judged by this singular, vital contribution. Without a son to carry on the name and the legacy, her place in the family and society itself became precarious and often ultimately nullified. Number 5, the economic engine, children as survival and prosperity. In 1242, the world was a vast and demanding place, and survival was often a brutal, day-to-day struggle. There were no social safety nets, no pensions, no widespread healthcare system. For the vast majority of people, the family unit was the sole engine of economic production, a miniature economy unto itself. In this context, children were not merely a blessing or a sign of divine favor. They were an absolute economic necessity, the very gears of the family's survival and future prosperity. To be barren, to be unable to contribute to this crucial economic engine, was therefore a profound practical failure that could spell destitution for a family and social death for the woman. Consider the life of a peasant family, the bedrock of medieval society. Their existence revolved around the land. They tilled the soil, planted crops, harvested, and raised livestock. This was incredibly labor-intensive work, and every pair of hands counted. Children, from a very young age, were integrated into the family's workforce. Even small children could help with chores like gathering firewood, minding livestock, or tending to younger siblings. As they grew, they took on increasingly demanding tasks: plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, milling grain, preparing food, spinning wool, and maintaining the household. A family without children was a family without an adequate workforce. This meant more strain on the parents, a reduced capacity for production, and ultimately, a lower yield from their land or craft. Imagine a farmer and his wife struggling to manage their small plot of land by themselves, while their neighbors had several strong sons and daughters helping them. A barren couple would be at a distinct disadvantage, their capacity to earn a living severely hampered. They might struggle to grow enough food for themselves, let alone generate a surplus to sell or trade. Their meager resources would diminish, threatening their very subsistence. Moreover, children were the only real form of old age support available. Parents toiled their entire lives, often with the unspoken understanding that their children would, in turn, care for them in their twilight years. When parents became too old or too frail to work the land, it was their adult children who would take over the farm, continue the trade, and provide for their parents' food and shelter. Without children, a couple faced a terrifying future of potential destitution, reliance on unreliable charity, or the grim prospect of the workhouse, if such existed, or simply starving. Their life's work would have no one to carry it on, no one to reap its benefits, and no one to provide for them in their most vulnerable state. Let's take the example of Eamon and Maeve, a couple farming a small holding in rural Ireland in 1242. Eamon was a strong man, Maeve a diligent woman, but after 10 years, no children had blessed their humble home. Each spring, Eamon would gaze at his fields, knowing he needed more hands than just his and Maeve's. Their neighbors, with their sons already helping with the plowing and daughters aiding with the cooking and spinning, were clearly more prosperous. Eamon and Maeve struggled to keep up, constantly worried about the next harvest. Their future was a blank space. Who would tend the sheep when Eamon's back gave out? Who would make the cheese when Maeve's hands trembled with age? The sight of other families, bustling with children, was a constant, painful reminder of their own economic vulnerability. Maeve, as the woman, bore the brunt of this anxiety. She was the one who was supposed to produce these crucial economic units. Beyond the immediate labor and old age support, children were also vital for family continuity and the transfer of skills and knowledge. Craftspeople like blacksmiths, weavers, or potters relied on their children to learn the trade and continue the family business. A son would apprentice with his father, inheriting not just the tools, but the specialized knowledge and reputation that had been built up over generations. Without an heir, the family's craft, their unique skill, and their economic legacy could simply vanish. Prosperity of a family was often measured by its ability to pass on its trade, its lands, or its standing to the next generation, ensuring a stable future. In a society where land ownership, however modest, was the primary source of wealth, children were the keys to its perpetuation. Land was often inherited or leased through family lines. Without children, land might revert to the lord of the manor, or be divided up among distant relatives, eroding the family's long-term economic security. Continuity of a family name was directly tied to the continuation of its economic base, and children, especially sons, were the essential link in that chain. Thus, a barren woman was not just a personal disappointment, she was an economic liability. Inability to bear children was perceived as undermining the very economic survival of her family, threatening its present stability and its future security. She was seen as someone who failed to contribute to the family's most vital resource, its human capital. This economic reality compounded all other forms of suffering associated with barrenness, reducing a woman's worth in a fundamentally practical, brutal, and undeniable way. It was a tangible, material consequence that underscored the social death sentence she faced, leaving her and her husband vulnerable in a world that offered no quarter to the unproductive. Number 6, the divine mandate, barrenness as God's punishment. In the year 1242, the world was steeped in religious belief, where the church held an immense and unquestioned authority over all aspects of life, from birth to death. Teachings of the Bible and the interpretations of the clergy formed the very worldview of the people. And within this deeply spiritual framework, the concept of fertility, of bearing children, was not merely a biological process. It was a divine mandate, a sacred duty, and a clear sign of God's blessing. Conversely, barrenness was often interpreted as a mark of divine displeasure, a punishment for sin, or a sign that God had turned his face away. This religious condemnation transformed barrenness from a personal affliction into a spiritual indictment, effectively serving as a religious death sentence that permeated every facet of a woman's existence. Biblical injunction to be fruitful and multiply from the book of Genesis was not just a suggestion, it was seen as God's first command to humanity. This verse, along with countless other biblical narratives, reinforced the idea that children were a gift from God, a blessing bestowed upon the righteous. Sarah, Rachel, Hannah, and Elizabeth, all prominent figures in the Old Testament who experienced barrenness before miraculously conceiving, were powerful stories that shaped people's understanding. Their initial barrenness was often presented as a test or a period of trial before God eventually intervened. The implication for women in 1242 was clear. If you were not conceiving, God was not blessing you, or perhaps was actively withholding his favor. This religious interpretation led to a profound internal struggle for women who could not conceive. They might spend countless hours in prayer, fasting, and making pilgrimages, desperately seeking divine intervention. They would question their own piety, wondering what sin they had committed, what failing on their part had angered God and caused him to withhold the blessing of children. Confessors, priests, and local holy men often reinforced this narrative, sometimes implying that a woman's barrenness was a sign of unconfessed sin, a lack of faith, or some moral impurity. This led to immense psychological distress, layering spiritual guilt onto the existing social pressure. Consider the feelings of Aveline, a young woman in a small French parish in 1242. She had been married for 3 years, and her womb remained stubbornly empty. Every Sunday she sat in church, listening to the priest preach about the sanctity of family, the joy of a full cradle, and the divine wisdom of God's creation. When the names of newly baptized infants were announced, Aveline would feel a sharp pang, not just of sorrow, but of intense shame. She knew the whispers, God has not blessed her. She began to scrutinize her own life, racking her brain for any sin she might have committed, a harsh word spoken, a moment of envy, a fleeting doubt, anything that could explain God's apparent turning away. She prayed longer, fasted more rigorously, and even gave more generously to the poor, hoping to appease a God she feared she had offended. This religious condemnation also impacted how communities viewed barren women. Barrenness was a sign of divine disfavor, then a barren woman might be subtly, or even overtly, treated as morally suspect. She might be considered less pious, less virtuous, or somehow unclean in a spiritual sense. This perception could affect her standing in the church community, perhaps making her feel unworthy of certain sacraments, or simply making her feel unwelcome in the very place meant to offer solace. The idea that God was punishing her made her an object of not just pity, but sometimes veiled judgment. Theological underpinnings of marriage further complicated matters. Marriage was seen as a sacrament, one of its primary purposes being procreation. If a marriage failed to produce children, it was considered to have failed in one of its fundamental purposes, a failure that, in the eyes of some religious thinkers, lessened its divine blessing. While the Church did not typically grant annulment solely on the grounds of barrenness, the failure to procreate could certainly be an underlying motivator for a husband to seek an annulment on other, often manufactured, grounds. In such cases, the woman's perceived divine disfavor might be used to justify her expulsion from the marriage. Moreover, the stories of barren biblical women who eventually conceived reinforced a cruel paradox. They offered hope, but also amplified the despair. If God had blessed Sarah or Hannah, why not her? This could lead to a deeper sense of abandonment by the divine, a feeling that she was uniquely singled out for punishment, or that her faith was simply not strong enough to elicit God's favor. In 1242, the pervasive belief that barrenness was a mark of divine displeasure was a heavy burden for women. It robbed them of spiritual peace, undermined their faith, and added a layer of profound existential dread to their already immense social and economic struggles. It wasn't just society that judged them, it was God himself, or so they were led to believe. This spiritual judgment, arguably the deepest and most personal form of condemnation, solidified the devastating social death sentence faced by women unable to conceive in the High Middle Ages.